formal welcome because we're a small group, we all know each other. But it's a delight to introduce this year's J.K. Russell Fellowship Program. We already had a class today, a great class between the five that had doctoral and seminary students, STL students, all looking at our distinguished fellows' work. We have our public forum now, tonight, and then of course, as you know, on Saturday, 1 to 5, right here, will be the research conference with respondents. So it is really an exciting time for us. As you know, our mission to encourage the theology and science conversation includes research, teaching, and public service. So the fellowship program, amongst all of our core programs, is unique in reaching out to all three of those program areas. Our fellow, use a colloquial tonight, is a former G2 doctoral student. I had the privilege of working with Noreen, as did Arthur, in 2000. Noreen is the Nicholas and Bernice Browder Professor of Science and Religion at St. John's University and College of St. Benedict. It was wonderful to know there's a chair out there. Keep that in mind, approaching graduates. She holds degrees in computer science and mathematics from Penn State University, and as I said, a PhD in theology from the G2 year 2000. She teaches courses in both the Departments of Computer Science and Department of Theology at St. John's and the College of St. Benedict, reflecting her two primary research interests: the intersection of religion and technology, and religion and conflict. And she's published a variety of books. I'm going to recommend, if you haven't read it, I think her very first book, which was her dissertation, published in the Fortress Press Science and Religion series. In Our Image, Artificial Intelligence and the Human Spirit. This was the book we discussed today. She's got an article in Zygon which brings us up to date on this book and presents it in a very lucid way. So I can also recommend for you to search the web for Zygon. Saturday, her conference will be More Than Information, a Christian critique of the new dualism that pervades artificial intelligence community. On a personal note, it's just a thrill to have Noreen here. She was a wonderful student and companion. I've learned a tremendous amount from her. Her expertise in computer science is unique in this field. There's hardly anyone in science and religion doing computer science. She's an expert in Christian spirituality, in Islamic spirituality, and she has really pioneered this field in bringing together, in I think a practically unique way, the computer sciences with theology. And the question she asks is really quite profound. Why do we think of ourselves in terms of a computer? Why do we think of computers in terms of us? So it's an interesting analogy. I asked her for the fellowship public lecture tonight to be a little more informal and talk about her own life journey. We'll see her some of her research on Saturday. But tonight I've invited Noreen at least to feel free to talk about herself. And so you see the title, Who is My Neighbor? Personal and Professional Journey from Bits, that's great, to Berkeley to Bosnia. I think we'll go for 50 minutes, an hour, have time for a Q&A before we break up. Please welcome me in welcoming Noreen back to the G2 for the research fellowship. Noreen, thank
you. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be back at the GTU. I just had a wonderful time this morning walking around the Cal campus and then all around the hill and seeing what has changed and what hasn't changed. But the warmth, the welcome, that hasn't changed. And it's just such a pleasure to be back here. As Bob said, he asked me to give you a rather informal talk. So I'm glad we're just a small group that can be around the table. And to give you a personal talk, to talk about my own journey. So, to put it in a nutshell, it goes from Bits to Berkeley to Bosnia. But I want to frame our discussion tonight with this quotation from the middle of the Gospel of Luke. It's when Jesus is asked by one of the Pharisees, what shall I do to obtain eternal life? And Jesus' answer is, well, you know the law. And the Pharisee says, well, yes, but what part of the law? And Jesus says, well, it can all be summed up as you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Do this, and you will live. So, in thinking about this, this verse, what does this really mean? Of course, the Pharisee comes back with, well, who is my neighbor? And that, of course, leads into the story of the Good Samaritan in the Luke Gospel. But I think that that first question that the Pharisee asks, who is my neighbor, also needs to have two related questions go along with it. That if you go back to the initial quotation, the neighbor isn't the only thing that's in there. In fact, the whole beginning of it is about loving the Lord your God. And that raises two other questions. Who am I, and who is my God? And these three questions, I think, are interdependent. It's very difficult to answer one of these questions without answering all three of them. At least that seems to be what I have found. So, to begin with, in speaking of my own journey, this is a little bit of prologue, so we're not at the bits part yet. But here's a little bit about my own particular background. I was raised as a Lutheran. If any of you are Lutheran, you're probably thinking, what kind of Lutheran? Because the Lutherans have many different branches. And I can say all of them, because I was baptized in the Missouri Lutheran Church, raised in the Wisconsin Lutheran Church. If you want to get even more strict than the Missouris, confirmed in the LCA Synod, and then went to an ALC college. So I think I hit them all. My own background, I come from a long line of Lutheran ministers. In fact, my cousin, who has looked at the family tree, swears that he can trace the ministerial lineage in my mother's family back to the son of a friend of Martin Luther's, who became a minister. The friend of Martin Luther's, the family name, by the way, is Brauer, which is German for brewer. And the friend of Martin Luther's was not a minister, but was instead a brewer. And family lore has it, at least, that before Martin was supposed to appear, before the Diet of Worms, that my ancestor gave him a nice big cask of Einbecker beer. And I said to my cousin, that kind of gives new meaning to "Here I stand, I can do no other." I'm sure the story is apocryphal, but it's part of our family lore. I went off to St. Olaf College, which is probably best exemplified by its many choirs, with the intent of actually gaining a Bachelor of Music degree and being a musician. And after pursuing that for a couple of years and realizing that my dreams outstripped my talent, I also picked up a math major along with my music major. And that then sent me off to Penn State, where I went to study first mathematics and then computer science. Now at Penn State, probably in a bit of the spirit of when in Rome, do as the Romans do, but I realized as I was thinking about it this evening, also in a bit of rebellion at bad liturgical music, I became a Quaker. And so there you get the second batch of pictures. I remain considering myself a Quaker to this day. So after I finished my degrees in mathematics and then computer science at Penn State, I got a job teaching computer science at St. John's University, which is represented by that bell banner and the Breuer architecture that's there. I did not keep carrying on the idea of when in Rome, do as the Romans do, or even take it literally. I haven't converted to Catholicism yet. It's a Benedictine university, but the Benedictines have had a deep, deep influence on my thinking. And I got my master's degree in theology from them there at St. John's. So that's just a little bit of prehistory there. I was teaching computer science. Taught for 7 years and came up for my first sabbatical. And thought, okay, I need to write something, I need to pursue an interesting question. I had been teaching artificial intelligence, and one question that I had was that while there were many philosophers writing on the question of can we build an artificial intelligence, make a computer that thinks like human beings do, my question was, why do we want to in the first place? And no one was writing on that. There was nothing in the literature. So I thought, great, well, wide open field, off I go. Headed off on my sabbatical, started thinking about this question, and suddenly realized I can't answer that question as a scientist. I don't have the training to answer this question, because this question is not about computers. This is a question about human motivations. It's a question about us, and a question probably best answered either philosophically or theologically. So I was thinking about AI, and these were my questions. So my first question was, why do we want AI? And as I thought about that question, it led to 3 other questions. Well, what of ourselves do we hope to image in that creation? With artificial intelligence, we're trying to take something that is completely other than us, but make it over in our image, to be like us. And I thought, in what ways? And then I thought, where have I heard this sort of talk about something being in the image of something else or someone else? And I thought, oh yeah, Genesis. Genesis 1, in fact, that we are made in the image of God. Concept that, at least in the West, we talk about as the imago Dei, the image of God in human beings. And so then I thought, well, this is interesting. Is the way we are imaging God similar at all to the way we want computers to image us? And then will computers be our neighbor? Will the neighborhood get a lot bigger all of a sudden? Okay, so these questions came up. As I thought about the middle questions, the middle 2 questions, what is it we hope to image in the computer? How do we want the computer to be like us? And is that the same or have any similarity with how we are in the image of God? I thought, well, it might not be. It might look like this. You know, that humanity has certain traits or does certain things, and we overlap some things with computers, and we overlap completely different things with God. You know, this could be quite possible. Usually when I tell people that I'm in both computer science and theology, they say, whoa, you couldn't be in 2 more different fields. They don't overlap, do they? And I say, well, yeah, they do a lot. You know, but it isn't the first thing that comes to your mind, that there's any overlap here. So it could look like that. Or it could look like this, that there is overlap. Okay, and then the question becomes, how big is that red circle in the middle? Do they overlap just a little? Do they overlap a lot? You know, do they overlap pretty much completely? And in a somewhat related way, I also thought, maybe it's more like this, that human beings stand in the middle, and we look at what it is that we value the most in ourselves, and then we project that outward in 2 directions. Saying, well, if this is what we value, then that must be what we share with God, and that's what we want to give to computers. You know, in that case, the picture should look more like the second picture, with a lot of overlap, rather than the first picture, with no overlap whatsoever. So, those were the questions that I had in mind, and they turned out to be questions of who are we as human beings? What is it that we value in ourselves? How do we see ourselves as it being in the image of God? And what is it of ourselves that we want to give to computers? So that kind of threw me away from this who's my neighbor question, more into the who am I question. And it brought me here to Berkeley, to the GTU, to follow this question. Actually, at first I thought, I'm going to take just a couple of theological anthropology classes at St. John's, you know, in the summer or in my spare time while I'm teaching. That's all I'm going to need. But so the Quakers say way leads on to way, and course led on to course. And the next thing I knew, I thought, whoa, I only need a few more, and I've got a master's degree. So I did that, and then I thought, that was a lot of fun. Well, why don't I go get a PhD? So I applied for a 2-year leave of absence from my position and came out here, which was a wonderful thing to do. And I worked with Bob, and I looked first at how we have understood the image of God to be in us. And first of all, I found out that there were a gazillion answers to that. Some of them are rather bizarre, I thought. I mean, one, I've forgotten who said it now. I think it was Kohler said, it's that we walk upright on 2 legs. And I thought, wait, how do we know God walks upright on 2 legs? You know? But I think it was a way of saying what's different from us and the other animals. So that was the way he was looking at that. And that's how many of the theologians first approached this, and tended to agree with Aristotle, who said man is the rational animal. And then said, okay, we are our minds. It's our intellect, our rationality, you know. It's like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. You know, it all comes down to the fact that we think. And so this was also the first way that computer scientists decided to approach artificial intelligence. They said, you know, well, we must have these rules that we think by. All we need to do is figure out what are the rules for thinking, and we can program those into a computer. And they started with things where the rules were well known, like doing calculus problems. And then proceeded to games, like playing chess. And were very successful back in the 60s and early 70s at these things. But then people started saying, well, wait a minute, aren't we just being successful because these are areas that do have a lot of very clear rules? You know, and in chess it's a very bounded game. You've got 64 squares, you've got only a certain number of pieces, each piece only moves by certain rules, so it's pretty easy to say, yeah, here are the rules. Okay, but a lot of more general, actually mundane thinking is much harder to codify in a set of rules. We don't actually know the rules that we follow to do many rather simple tasks. We simply learn how to do them with practice over time. And so this idea that the mind was something that could be captured in a set of rules went out of favor in artificial intelligence. Well, it also went out of favor in theology around the turn of the previous century, when people were saying, yeah, we are, Aquinas said, you know, it's our rationality, our intellect, that is the image of God in us. But that seemed, you know, a bit limiting to say that the image of God was just reason. One of the problems with that actually hit people around the time of World War I, when people said, it seems like reason is not always leading us into a good place. And this is especially came home to theologians after World War II, when they said, you know, there are reasons that Hitler's final solution can be seen as very reasonable in a certain way. You know, it's following a certain line of reasoning. But this isn't very godly. And so maybe a God, you know, who like the God of the Gospel of John is described as God as love, is not necessarily best captured by reason or intellect. And so although this was the first approach taken in both fields, it was abandoned at a certain point by most people. Now, there was a lingering project thinking that all of our thinking could be turned into rules that kind of lingered into the early 2000s. I think it's pretty much over now. It didn't produce what it was supposed to for artificial intelligence. There are a few theologians who still would say it's our intellect that is the way we image God, but most would not anymore. So, there are still, however, computer scientists who do think of us as being primarily our minds. One of them is Ray Kurzweil, who's written quite a bit. He wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines. And I think the spiritual machines are actually us, in his viewpoint, because he sees us in a very mechanistic way. And one of the things he wrote in that book was, up until now, our mortality was tied to the longevity of our hardware. When the hardware crashed, that was it. As we cross the divide to instantiate ourselves into our computational technology, our identity will be based on our evolving mind file. So we're just a mind file. We will be software, not hardware. As we periodically port ourselves to the latest, ever more capable personal computer, our immortality will be a matter of being sufficiently careful to make frequent backups. I'll be talking a lot more about this viewpoint on Saturday, so I'm not going to say too much about it tonight, except to simply use that as an example of the fact that there still are people out there who think we are just our minds, that's what we are. There's a second view, however, and that is to say we are what we do. Okay? We are our actions. And in the field of computers, this came into vogue in the 1980s. The field of artificial intelligence went into a real slump in the late 70s and early 80s when people suddenly realized that, okay, yes, we had computers who could do pretty good calculus, play not a bad game of chess, but we weren't getting very far on other things that were more human-like. At that point, computers had a lot of trouble with navigation. Just getting out of this room would have been very difficult for a robot. A lot of difficulty with recognizing, making sense of regular prose. And so people decided, well, let's just get the computers to do certain tasks and do them well. And they don't even have to do them the way a human would do them. And then we went into the age of what was called expert systems. And expert systems meant that the computer would have a human-like ability to do a very narrow task. Maybe, playing chess, for one thing, or maybe diagnosing certain blood illnesses, or doing certain chemical analyses. And these programs were quite successful. Now, if we look at, was there a similar movement in theology, we find that there was. That biblical exegetes in the 20th century looked at the Genesis text, and they said, at the point where it says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, the same sentence goes right on to say, and let them have dominion over, and then lists the birds and the creeping things and the animals and everything that's upon the earth. So they said, looks like dominion is related to this image stuff. They also looked at extra-biblical sources and found that the idea of an image was used, for example, when the king would send a vice-regent off into the provinces, that vice-regent would sometimes be called the image of the king. And so they said, this might have been in the priestly writer's mind when he wrote this text, and it seems a good idea to think that it's really doing a function. Okay, we image God when we do God's work on earth. in that case we could say, well, then the computer images us when it does our work. Perhaps in the provinces where we don't want to go, like the Mars rover, or places where we cannot go. Okay? So this view remains in vogue, both as a way of understanding the image of God in us and as a way of looking at computers to say the computers don't have to do everything we do, and they don't have to do it the same way we do, they just have to go out there and do things that we would do. But a lot of people were somewhat dissatisfied with this. Okay? There are a couple of reasons to be dissatisfied with this, you know. I love this cartoon. They said, well, look, it does seem that our tools, after a while, they do things that we do better than we do. But when we got to the computer, people began to worry a great deal about the computer doing our tasks. And they tended to divide things into two things. Into one group, they would say, oh, it's absolutely great that the computer does this task. You know, I always tell my students when I say, think about robots. And of course, they think about science fiction robots. And then I show them a picture of a Roomba going around and vacuuming the floor. And I say, no, that's robots today. And nobody looks at the Roomba and says, oh my God, we're doomed. You know, it's vacuuming. You know, we say, this is wonderful. It's vacuuming. Great. You know? But we worry when the computer does other tasks. One of the reasons we worry, which was brought up in the class this afternoon, is that whenever you have a new technology, you may have unintended results, unintended effects. If you have unintended effects from a vacuum cleaner, it's probably going to be nothing worse than scaring the dog, you know, or something like that. And I love this picture. I always use this when I talk about unintended effects. But whenever we do something, there will be unintended effects. Sometimes we know what the negative effects will be, but we ignore them. Other times, we don't know what they're going to be. We haven't thought about what those unintended effects might be. So there are those that worry about computers in a functional mode. I think one of the biggest worries right now that's coming up as robotics work is proceeding, you know, full speed ahead, is simply the unintended effects on the economy. You know, how many jobs will be taken over by robots or by some sort of artificial intelligent program? We've already seen a lot of it happen. I mean, how many gas station attendants are hired these days? We all pump our own gas and let the computer figure it out. How many bank tellers don't need to be hired because we can use cash machines? In factories, so many things are quickly being automated. But even what we think of as white-collar work, the work of paralegals, probably the work of many lawyers will very soon be able to be automated. And so much of what they do is pretty much, you know, looking for precedents in the law, that kind of thing. Computers that now handle a lot of big data can handle those things. So as we look at that, we think there will be a lot of effects economically. Finally, I looked at a third one, and that says, okay, we aren't necessarily our minds, we aren't necessarily what we do, maybe it's that we are, in other words, corporate, we are a corporate group. And in systematic theology in the 20th century, this became the dominant way of understanding the Imago Dei. You see it especially well in Karl Barth, but you see it in a number of other systematic theologians as well. And then the question comes, well, what about in computer science? Do we really want, you know, if we say that we image a triune God, a God that is always in relationship within God's very self, we image that when we are in relationship with each other. But do we want to share that kind of relationship with computers? You know, is that really what we have in mind? Well, my first thought was, meet Roxy. Okay. Actually, there are people working towards computers that you can have a certain type of relationship with. But it isn't just that type of relationship. Here are pictures of some other recent robots. On the left we have Einstein there. They're getting the faces to be remarkably realistic. On the right there is a robot that a Japanese researcher made. He used his daughter as a prototype. His daughter absolutely hates it, of course. Robots like that, when I show these pictures to my students, you know, I show the first one and all the guys in my students in computer science are almost all guys. You know, they're going, yeah, you know, I'll take that one. When I show them this one, especially the little girl, it kind of freaks them out. There's this thing that we call the uncanny valley in robotics, and that is that it's nice to have a robot look sort of human, you know, and maybe if a robot could look totally human, it would be all right. But there's this uncanny valley in the middle where they look quite human, but not quite. And that seems to bother people a very great deal. And yet, you can tell by the very fact that these sorts of robots are being made that people are thinking in relational terms. They're thinking that if a robot is going to be most useful in human community, it should kind of look like us, and we should be able to relate to it as if we were relating to another human being. And of course, this is Kismet, a lab prototype at MIT. And this was an interesting experiment. They were trying to build robots. It was preceded by one called Cog that looked a little less human, and it was followed by one called Nexi that looks a little less mechanical than this one, but they're all kind of in the same line. And the thought was, when people interact with these robots, the robots will learn from that interaction. That didn't happen. The robots didn't learn. What was interesting, though, was what we learned from these robots was how quick people were to interact with the robot, to try to form a relationship with the robot, to talk to the robot and treat it as if it were almost human. And so I think what these robots told us was very little about the capabilities of computers, because the robots really didn't end up learning anything that they weren't programmed already to do. But they told us quite a bit about human nature, that we're hardwired to be in relationship with just about anything that looks like it's relating back to us. So we are very relational creatures, which is one reason why I tend to side with Karl Barth and the systematicians to say that something that stands at the absolute core of who we are is not so much our intellectual capabilities, not so much anything that we do, because there's no one particular thing that we all do, but it is our absolute need to be in relationships with others. And it's certainly been borne out by psychologists who have found that, particularly small children who are who don't have those kind of close human relationships simply do not develop well, fail to thrive, and in some cases even die. So we really are relational creatures. And we see this also in science fiction look at AI, that almost all of the artificial intelligences in science fiction are highly relational creatures, whether they look like us or don't look like us, whether they have our kind of intellect or not. We want them basically to be something that we can relate to. Sorry about this slide. It came out a little different on this different form of PowerPoint. are computers going to be our neighbors? Are we going to end up relating to them? I would say, and this I'm saying not as a theologian, but as a computer scientist, not in the near future. Okay? Artificial intelligence progresses extremely slowly. It progresses on the fronts that are not too human-like, although we tend to have a sliding scale there, and as soon as we have a program to do something, we say, oh, that's not really artificial intelligence. That's just a computer program. Okay? But because I think our ultimate goal is that relational sort of robot, and we're not getting very close to that. So what about it? I kind of finished my book by turning to my Benedictine heritage and looking at the rule of St. Benedict, where he says, regard all the utensils of all the goods of the monastery as if they were the sacred vessels of the altar, aware that nothing is to be neglected. And so I think that gives us an ethic for treating the kinds of computers that we have, saying, no, they're not us. We're not going to treat them as if they were another human being. But we can treat them with respect. We can treat them, as Benedict said, treat all the goods of the monastery with respect, the same way you respect the plate and the chalice, the vessels of the altar, knowing that God's grace is in all of creation. And so God is not only found in that wine and bread, but found in all of creation. Okay, so who is my neighbor? Well, when Jesus goes on to be asked this question, and he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the answer that he's really giving to the Pharisee is the neighborhood is bigger than you think it is. It isn't just, your fellow Pharisees. It isn't just your fellow Israelites. It's the Samaritans too. Okay? It's everybody. And computers are making our neighborhood even bigger than it was. I think it is not because they are really joining the neighborhood as co-neighbors. They're not doing that. But it is the technology itself that is enlarging our neighborhood. So that our neighborhood now means we can reach people who are very distant, very easily. Send them emails, Skype, tweet, Facebook. Our neighborhood has grown. This can also be overwhelming, and it can sometimes send us into retreat. So a couple of pictures I like. This is a picture of the internet, and it just gives you an idea of the scale of the connections, the web of connections around the globe. And sometimes it can feel more like this, the information highway is chugging away up there, kind of overwhelming way, and maybe it would be nice to just get off of that and on your bicycle and write some letters by hand for a change. One retreat for many of the young people, the young men that I teach, is into video games. And this is a way in which they retreat from the real neighborhood of the people around them and into a neighborhood that feels much more easy to master, much more controllable to them. And this is a whole other can of worms that I think is a very important one when you think about, I have students in my class who admit to playing video games at least 30 hours a week. That's practically a full-time job that they're doing that. This is a brand new thing in the human family. And I'm afraid it's too tempting a retreat for too many of them. I love this one too. We can not only retreat from each other, as we might do when we play a video game, or when we're all sitting around, holding our smartphones up to our face instead of being with the people we're around, we can retreat from God as well, as we let computers mediate our world, take over our world. I just love that picture. okay, and then of course there's this, you know, we can be in touch with each other. It is probably not the same as being in touch offline. And so that too changes the nature of our relationship with our neighbor. Okay? So this leads me into a little plug for Saturday's talk, and that is to say, in our Christian faith, we hold an embodied faith. We talk in the Apostles' Creed about believing in the resurrection of the body. We talk, you know, just today, Arthur was showing me a text by Irenaeus that says, if Jesus was not bodily raised, then you know, the whole Eucharist makes no sense, then there is no body in the bread, there is no blood in the wine. But we do hold to a sacramental faith. We also hold to a faith that believes in the incarnation, that God himself took on a human body, that bodies are of tantamount importance. So I'll be talking on Saturday about this question, that there's a new dualism creeping into a lot of Western thought that says that we are information, that we can be categorized by either the information of our genes or more the information that is held at some given moment in the neural synapses of our brain and is trying to move away from an embodied view of the human person. Now, this takes me to part 3. Now, why did it say from Vitz to Berkeley to Bosnia in my title? And this is partly something to say as my tribute to the GTU. That when I came here, I did my doctorate in Christian spirituality. And as part of the protocol for Christian spirituality, I had to do a comprehensive exam in non-Christian spirituality. I chose Islam, which was somewhat unusual. This was back in the 90s. And, but I had, the Quakers would say, well, I had a leading that told me to do this. It was probably partly based on having heard that Islam was the fastest growing faith in America, and which it was at the time, probably still is. And it was long before 9/11 happened. And for many of us, you know, when we think about Islam, this is a picture that simply comes to our minds. It was this picture that actually got me into teaching theology. When I finished my doctorate here, I went back to St. John's. I went back to teaching computer science full time. But when 9/11 happened, there were no courses on world religions or on Islam.
This is the theology and science, right?
Yes, it is. But you kind of missed most of it, so...
I know, because I had to be at the mercy of the bus because I don't have a BART ticket.
Well, that's too bad. Well, we'll finish up and then you can ask some questions if you like. So anyway, I was teaching computer science, but there were no courses on Islam at my school. So I went to the provost and I said, well, I did this comp on Islam. I'm not a real expert, but I can teach something on it. And I began teaching a course on
What school was that?
It's St. John's
I need
University.
to wait till the end.
So I began teaching Islam, and from that was invited to go as part of a small faculty group to Bosnia, where we had numerous students coming from at the time. And that took me to a war-torn land, something that I had not seen before. It was not that long after the war had been resolved. It was about 6-7 years after the Dayton Accords. It was a land where, in that war, 97% of the minarets in that country were destroyed. There's a picture on the left. It was a land where people had decided, though they had long been neighbors, that they wished to be neighbors no longer. That they wished to wipe out not just certain groups of faith that were living among them, but the very memory of the fact that those people were ever there. And so this was the countryside that I saw. There was one area where I think we drove for 30 miles and did not see a single intact house. And this really was a shock to me. And it led me to thinking in different ways about this question of who is my neighbor, and how we can go astray in thinking very quickly that certain people are not our neighbors, or allowing our technology to overtake our better natures, our better sense of who is my neighbor. And the final piece of my journey was to win a Fulbright and to go over to Sarajevo and teach for a year. And I taught in the faculty of Islamic Studies over there and taught technology and religion, and finished my second book while I was living in Sarajevo. But that experience led me to thinking much more deeply about this question, and coming back to this verse, that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, and your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Do this and you will live. And the recognition that it takes all three questions. It takes answering this question, who am I, first? And then answering this question, who is my Lord, and what does my Lord call me to, before I can actually answer that question, who is my neighbor? And that one of the dangers that we find in our technology is precisely the fact that it's so easy to lose ourselves in that technology, to lose ourselves in its capabilities, to think that it is making the neighborhood larger, without realizing that in actuality it also has the danger of closing the neighborhood off, of reinforcing certain ways of thinking, because on the computer you can always find an affinity group who will think like you do, and in that reinforcement, turning us against seeing other groups of people as our neighbor, which is the answer that I think Jesus intended when he was asked that question. So, I'm going to stop there and let you have some comments, or time for discussion and questions. Yeah.
Well, I'm just curious what advice you have on how to be neighborly. I guess it would be nice to focus on this country. I mean, but the lessons from Bosnia, from Rwanda, from South Africa, have there been lessons? And in this country, I guess the big problem is the Democrats and the Republicans are not working together.
Yeah.
So what have you learned that can fix it?
I wish I could fix it. If I had the answer, I'd love to fix it. I don't have an answer. I wish I did. One of the things I tell my students is put down your devices for a while and talk to each other. But I think we have a problem as a larger society in that our technology has allowed us to separate off into affinity groups, even when it comes just to getting the nightly news. So some people watch Fox News, some people watch CNN, some people watch MSNBC, and they actually get not even just a different spin on the story, they get completely different stories. And what concerns me is that we've moved away from, first of all, having sort of one story, that Walter Cronkite told us at night, so that's the way it is. at least then we had one story that we might interpret differently. We don't have that anymore. We have different stories. And I'm afraid that we're moving away from a fact-based sort of a way of informing ourselves, so that everything has a spin to it of some sort, or even it goes so far as certain political operatives who have said, the facts don't matter, we make up the facts, you know. And that I think is a real danger. And it's a danger that has gotten worse because of our technology. Wow.
A great question that came up in class today was why it is that there's this parallel between the three kinds of images of God and images of ourselves in AI. Can you want to just remind us that there are those three kinds?
Yeah, there are those three kinds, you know. In both fields, people started with a sort of a substantive view, centering on the mind and rationality, moved then to a functional view, and moved then to a relational view. And you might ask, well, why in the world would theologians follow the same trajectory, and then computer scientists follow the same trajectory as theologians did? And I think it has to do with, you know, I would go back to that slide. In fact, let's see. No, it's not real easy to do, but the slide that had the human being standing in the middle, you know, the computer on one side, kind of God on the other, and say that it really comes down to the fact that we're really, in both cases, thinking less about the computer, more about God, and more about ourselves. You know, that we are actually thinking, who are we? And then projecting that in two directions. And as we think about who are we, at least from a Western viewpoint, we start with the idea that we are our minds, and then we find that the limitations to that. And so then, you know, start looking in another direction. And that happened both in theology and in computer science. It's not odd that we would start thinking that we are our minds. You know, it also came up in class. They said, well, would a different kind of being, say an extraterrestrial in person, think the same way? And I said, you know, it might depend on where their sensory organs are located. In other words, when you think about it, our strongest sensory organs, our eyes, our ears, you know, our nose and mouth, are all in a very tiny bit of our real estate. You know, and we tend to think, okay, you know, if you chopped me off at the neck, you know, maybe transplanted my head to a different body, I would still be me. I'm just all right here. Okay? A different being who might not be all in one spot might not feel that way. So it's easy enough for us to start by saying, yep, I'm my head. What goes on in my head. But then to quickly find out, no, I'd better be more than that. So then you say, well, it must be what I do. But then you find out, well, what do you mean, do anything? You know? So then you think, well, no, it's a certain limited, it's a subset of what we do. It's the being together, where we really find the God that's described as love arising, and where we really would find what we probably are looking for in artificial intelligence. Now, you might say there are two projects in artificial intelligence. One is get computers to do stuff, and the other is get computers to be like us. We tend to conflate those two projects and think it's all one project. It really shouldn't be. You know, we really should keep those separate and say, we're making pretty good progress in getting computers to do stuff, and that's fine. We're not making a lot of progress in getting computers to be like us, and maybe that's fine too. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about this push for embodied mind or embodied cognition in AI?
Yeah.
If it's making any difference.
Well, it's a push for two reasons. The first reason for an embodied cognition is to say if we're really going to get a computer that can truly be relational, it's going to have to be able to interact with its environment on its own. You know, it's going to have to be able to make free choices and to learn from what it does. And it's pretty hard to learn without being embodied in some way. And so one idea is simply we need to embody computers so that they can be free agents within an environment and learn from that environment. The second thought is simply if we embody computers in a human-like body, it's going to be easier for human beings to relate to them and to work with them. And that one I think is kind of a mixed bag. In one sense, that's true. I think it's easier to talk, for example, to a robot than just like to Siri on your phone. But on the other hand, I think there's also some danger in that. As I said, we have this great propensity to relate. And it might be that, particularly for certain people, they would just find it much easier to relate to maybe a more predictable entity in a robot. Although, in the long run, I think people would find it dissatisfying. You know, in the sense, for example, of feeling emotion. I've been looking recently at the question of empathy, and this will come up in my Saturday talk as well. And could a computer be truly empathic, really feel empathy for someone? You know, be like Bill Clinton, I feel your pain, you know. And the problem is, when you look at just about any emotion, the definition that's current right now, I use one from Jerome Kagan, but he says that for an emotion, there is a stimulus, there is then a physical reaction. You feel the emotion. You then have a mental analysis of what you feel, and then a response. So if you think, for example, that you know, you're walking up in Tilden Park, and you hear this rustling in the bushes. You know, before you even have time to consciously think about it, your heart rate is going to speed up. You know, you're going to have that shot of adrenaline. And then you're going to analyze that and think, oh, yes, I heard something rustling, that might be a mountain lion. Okay? And then you're going to decide on your response, whether you run away or turn and look at the bush where you heard the rustling, or what is it that you do. And so our emotions are deeply rooted in that second stage, because that first perception is often at a subconscious level. And then what we actually perceive first is that feeling of fear, that clutch, or in any other emotion, with love, that warm feeling that you feel. And then you think about it and identify it, and then you have a reaction. Now, there are people who don't have that feeling stage, and computers don't have it because they're not embodied. So computers jump over that second stage. There's a stimulus, they calculate a response, and then do the response. Now, if a person is that way, you know, if a person, let's say, sees something happening, doesn't feel any emotion, but calculates and says, oh, but I do see something happening, and most people would respond this way, therefore I will respond that way. How would you feel about that person? You know, what would you say about a person who doesn't actually feel emotion, but just calculates responses?
A sociopath?
Yeah, you'd say that's a sociopath. We have a name for people like that. And these people can be very good at, you know, doing the first part of an emotion, seeing the cue, and then calculating an appropriate response, but they don't feel anything. And a relationship with a sociopath over a long term is not a very satisfying thing.
The example would be Hal in the movie 2001. He is capable of experiencing fear, but he murders all but one of the crew members in the ship without even, there's no sense of remorse or anything.
Right.
That was what people were fearful of then, and I think now about artificial intelligence, if this was the kind of thing we would have. There have been, I think, in science fiction and fantasy literature over the years, robots with human-type emotions from Star Wars on back. The robot, but Star Wars was what's called science fantasy. That is science fiction that plays fast and loose with the scientific facts.
That's exactly it. So we have portrayed robots as having human-like emotions, but they are playing fast and loose with what we can actually do. Because
Asimov came up with his 3 laws of robotics, but why would a robot follow they would be programmed in that a robot could not harm anybody, a robot would be obedient, and a robot would only, that was something that would be part of the programming, but that's...
Right. And
He put that forward as a way of preventing that kind of thing.
Yeah, but even there, when you look at that, and you say, well, it was programmed into the computer. Karl Barth, very interestingly, gives 4 criteria for an authentic relationship. And he says, you must be able to look the other person in the eye. You must be able to listen to them. You must be able to give them aid, and you must do it gladly. And in with the gladly part is you must do it of your own free will and volition. If you give someone aid simply because you're forced into it, that violates his understanding of a true relationship. And so you have to ask that question of an artificial intelligence. If they give you aid because they were programmed that they must do it, if they did not have the option not to do it, is that an authentic relationship? It does seem to be missing something at that point, I think.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how we know the difference. So, and to take your example of the sociopath, you can't get inside that person's head or inside their emotions to see what they're. You have to deduce that from what you see. There's some clue that's missing, and so there's, I guess, at least theoretically, there's always the possibility that someone will make a robot that is so good at that that you can't tell that they don't have emotions. The little girl there is crying, because she sees you cry and you cry. Thinking of that, what was when the therapist that way back when I first got a computer.
Oh, Eliza?
Eliza, right. So you type in your problem and Eliza, I'm feeling sad, and she answers, I'm sorry to hear that. Tell me more about that.
Right.
And it just keeps going and it goes on forever. And you think, well, that's what my therapist always said. You could, but eventually you go, wait a minute. She's recycling back again. This doesn't feel genuine anymore.
Right.
But it's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is that tips you off. This is not a real person.
Yeah, it is hard to put your finger on that. It usually is something that we identify over time. Like with a sociopath, they can seem very charming at first. And people will get into serious relationships with them. But then often find that over time they say that there's something hollow here. And I think we would find that with the same thing with computers.
Time for 1 or 2 more comments or questions. How does that relate to the Turing test? It sounds a little bit similar, you can't tell.
Yeah, the Turing test, which is test where you carry on conversation, and if a certain percentage of the time you can't tell, you know, that you're carrying on a conversation with a machine, you could say that the machine had intelligence. Some people have said, in fact they said last summer that the Turing test had been won because there was this chatbot that pretended to be a 14-year-old boy from Ukraine, and it was answering questions on Twitter, and for a while had some people fooled into thinking it really was a 14-year-old boy from Ukraine. But you really can't count that in the sense that, first of all, Turing had a much deeper discussion in mind than the general exchange of tweets. Plus, there was an advantage that, you know, this program was assuming, you know, was saying English wasn't his first language, and, you know, so every time, you know, there was something, you could just say, sorry, I didn't understand that, you know. The Turing test, though, is a relational test. It's expecting that in extended discourse, you will think that you are with a human being. And the kind of extended discourse Turing had in mind, which would range over a whole range of subjects and fields, no computer has come anywhere close to passing. So it does seem to be a test that says, at the most rudimentary level, the computer has to be relational, at least in discourse. So I believe that it is a test of relationality. It's of a relationality of a limited form.
Right. I was just thinking of a kind of rough analogy.
Yeah.
Arthur's point about how would you know if this person has genuine feelings?
Yeah.
You know, if they seem to.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, it is something that you would only know over time.
Right.
And if you've seen the movie Her, you know, there's something about that kind of in there. He's quite sure that the computer has genuine feelings and is in love with him as he is with her, you know, and then of course finds out that, no, you know, this is the way she talks to everybody who uses that program. So you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah, I'm just wondering about, one of the questions you asked was the motivation of why are people developing AI and stuff like that, what's the purpose? And I would have thought that a major factor is that it's one of the best methods for learning about our minds. How, in other words, in order to make the computer intelligent, we have to figure out how our intelligence works.
You know, it's interesting.
Is that a motivation for something?
Because that was given as a motivation back in the 1980s. And that has become, I think, much less important than it was. That now people are thinking, well, with the advent of new techniques in neuroscience, we have better ways to get at understanding our own minds, and that artificial intelligence, which is kind of promised to be an avenue for that kind of understanding, really hasn't given us much.
No, I 100% agree with you about big data. I mean, the people doing big data, which is they're not at all interested in how people do it. They're just doing with massive knowledge, massive data. So big data has taken over the world of the computer.
Right now, big data is nothing.
So the old AI types who are trying to understand how we work are not around much, I guess.
Not really. I don't think that people are viewing AI anymore as a way to understand the human brain.
I think that's right.
And I think that's for two reasons. One is that neuroscience has made a lot of advancements, and they've decided we've got a better way.
No, it's not neuroscience, it's cognitive science.
Cognitive science, but also neuroscience, that people are really starting to say if we can understand what happens at the neuronal level, you know, that will help us to better understand our brains and how we think, and, you know, maybe what a thought is. One problem right now in cognitive science is that we're kind of missing the middle ground. In other words, you know, with fMRIs and PET scans, you can kind of see big things going on in the brain. You can say, okay, when a person is meditating, this part of their brain is lighting up. You know, when a person is doing other things, you know, you can even say so much as that you can tell if you give a person a series of pictures and you look at their brain, you know, then later you can simply look at their brain and tell which of that series of pictures they're actually looking at. Okay, so this is on a pretty big level. We also know a lot more now about what goes on at the neuronal level. What we don't know is how it gets from one to the other. In other words, how does what goes on, you know, across the synapses at the neuronal level actually end up representing a thought? We have no idea. You know, so it's sort of that, you know, that stage in between that we don't have.
Yeah.
But nobody sees artificial intelligence as being promising in
No, it's
that
not
sense.
hard.
You see, it kind of goes back to when people thought in the substantive way that all we need to do is figure out the rules of thinking and give those rules to the computer, then they thought, if we come up with the right rules, we'll really understand how we think. Now that we realize that a lot of our thought is just not rule-based that way, we've moved away from seeing AI as a good avenue for self-understanding.
It just reminds me, 2 days ago, maybe it was Monday, 3 days, George Lakoff gave a big talk to the linguistics department here, and he's writing a book on things related to what you're talking about. And I think that that's going to be an important book. It'll be out probably in a year, so keep your eyes peeled. What? Cognitive science, linguistics, computer, how language works. But it's heavy in this domain.
So does the decline in interest in AI at all reflect Hubert Gracchus's claim that AI was the end of the road for the Logos project of the work of Aristotle, that what's more unique about humanity is our ability to reason, not to be embodied? That was his critique of AI. And I'm wondering if he was right, and that accounts for the exact part of the decline of AI.
Possibly, yeah. I think that people have realized that to have a truly human-like intelligence, an AI would have to be embodied.
Right.
And even there, you know, as we look at more of the work that's coming out on emotion in particular, like Antonio Damasio's work, where he's showing that even things that we think are purely intellectual, our emotions are involved. That without emotions, we really can't think. And that says that I think there's a problem, because then you come back to that definition of emotion and how much emotion depends on our feeling, our bodily feeling, that emotion. Then you start saying the computer might not need to have a body just like ours, but it's going to need a body that is fantastically more complex than what we currently have, than just, say, a metal structure that is covered with a skin-like substance, so it sort of looks like us, but it's going to have to actually have some kind of an internal structure that allows it to feel internally, you know, as well as the haptic external feeling. Computers will have to learn how to feel internally, and I don't think we have thought at all about how to approach that.
Before we thank Noreen, remind you again, Saturday, 1 o'clock, right here, for a great research conference. Let's thank Noreen.